Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of James Polk, and the focus is getting started. Polk was born November 2nd, 1795 in his parents' one-room log cabin in Mecklenburg, North Carolina. His parents were Sam and Jenny Polk, but it was really his grandfather, Ezekiel, who was the leader of the family and sort of the most adventurous and entrepreneurial. In fact, he decided to take with him a bunch of the members of the family. As soon as Tennessee, on the western border of North Carolina, became its own state, he decided to head west, and this was dangerous territory. This was a hostile region mostly filled with Indians and very few white settlers so far at the time, but it was also an opportunity space, and that's what Ezekiel Polk was looking for. Well, Sam and Jenny Polk didn't go in that first tranche of passing off to the western part of the region, but they did come along about a decade later. In 1807, they took 11-year-old Jimmy with them and a bunch of other families and pioneers that headed west in a caravan. They eventually got to Nashville. They broke off from the rest, headed about 50 miles south, met up with Ezekiel and the rest of the family in Columbia, Tennessee, where they settled down. On their own farm, they started living off the land, but Sam also did well as both a surveyor and some land speculation, which was a popular thing to try to make some money on the western frontier. As for Jimmy Polk, well, he was a weak and sickly child. He just couldn't keep up with the other boys. His body was not robust enough. Even though he had sort of this dogged determination, he tried really hard, but he was physically unable to keep up, and to the point where they finally diagnosed him with having urinary stones. And this was a really difficult thing to treat at the time. In fact, Sam took his boy over 200 miles away to the expert in the region, Dr. Ephraim McDowell. And as far as his expertise, well, it was pretty barbaric, the procedure that Jim Polk was about to go through. His only anesthetic for this procedure was whiskey. He was tied down to a table, literally tied down, before the doctor took out his blade, and he cut through Polk's prostate on the way to his bladder, where he could finally collect those stones. Now, on the good side, after this terrible procedure, Polk's health was really restored. He felt great after this. The problem was he was also left sterile. He would not be able to have children as a result of this procedure, but at least he had his health, and his energy was starting to come back after the procedure. Polk had no formal education until he was 17 years old. At that point, he had a year of private tutoring before he spent 2 years at the Murfreesboro Academy, which he thrived in that environment. He was at the top of his class, and that opened up an opportunity to head east to the University of North Carolina. He entered in 1815 as a sophomore. He really thrived in this academic environment. And the best of all was his role in the Dialectic Society. He loved this. It was one of the 2 debating societies on campus. One of his first arguments was called the admission of foreigners into office in the United States. And Polk was opposed to this kind of foreign influence. He believed would insinuate itself into the favor of a credulous populace along with faction, that destroyer of social happiness and good order in society, that monster that has sunk nations into the vortex of destruction. Some of the early advocacy on behalf of Jim Polk. As a senior, he became a president of the Dialectic Society. When he graduated in 3 years, he finished first in honors in both math and classics. Again, really thrived in that academic setting. Now it's time to return back to Tennessee, which had gone through its own growth spurt just in the last couple of years. This is in the wake of the War of 1812. So the Americans had defeated the British, and more importantly in this region, the Indians. They had been consolidated into smaller territories, so it actually became much safer now in the area of Tennessee, and so a lot more folks were coming in. It's also an opportunity for Polk as he began his career training in the law. He decided to study under a former congressman by the name of Felix Grundy, who lived in Nashville, and Polk followed Grundy everywhere he went, in the office, in court, on the circuit. He was learning a lot, and then when Grundy actually was elected to the state legislature, he got Polk a job. He got Polk a job as the clerk of the Senate in the state. He did really well. In fact, he was rehired for 3 consecutive years. He was making lots of acquaintances, which is certainly going to help him in his political profession as well as his legal profession, which was starting to take off when he passed the bar in 1820 at the age of 25, and he made a change. He wasn't going to be Jimmy Polk anymore. He wasn't going to be Jim Polk. From now on, James Polk. Lawyer, future politician, he would go by James. And James was a leader in his community. He's only 25 years old, but he's got his own law practice. He's doing some land speculation with his father. He's a colonel in the local militia. So he decided to run for office. And his first race was in the state Senate. This is 1822. Polk, very Jeffersonian in his policies, believing in states' rights, individual liberty, fighting for that individual settler against the big money powers. He made a statement that we ought to do everything in our power to produce as nearly as practicable an equal distribution of lands, to induce foreigners to sell out of their lands so that they might be settled by independent freeholders who would feel an interest in the soil and become endeared to the government. Again, completely Jeffersonian in his perspective, and he won that first race to become a member of the state Senate. Growing up in and around Nashville, Polk was, not surprisingly, a big fan and admirer of Andrew Jackson, the military hero from the War of 1812 as a major general, first in the Tennessee militia and then in the regular army, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. And Polk had actually known Jackson for most of his life and had many interactions with him. Around this time, 1823, Jackson gave him some personal advice. You know what? You're moving up in the world. It's time to find yourself a wife. And so Polk said, well, who did you have in mind? And as the story goes, Jackson said, the one who will never give you trouble. Her wealthy family, education, health, and appearance are all superior. You know her well. And Polk responds, you mean Sarah Childress? Then I shall go ask her at once. And he did. Sarah Childress was the young woman that Polk had been seeing off and on. Jackson helped as a little bit of a catalyst. They engaged to get married, and they do get married on New Year's Day, 1824, a large country wedding at the Childress plantation. Sarah Childress, now Sarah Polk, was completely supportive of her husband's career throughout his entire life. She was also an astute political counselor. In fact, really his closest confidant. He really never had many close, intimate relationships with friends, only a couple here and there. Jackson had the biggest influence on his career, but on a personal level and on a steady state throughout that lifetime, Sarah Polk was really his closest confidant and his greatest inspiration in terms of their relationship in trying to move forward from a career standpoint. Well, the state Senate, that was a venue that was a little too small for James Polk. He wanted to go up the next rung on the political ladder, so he set his sights on the U.S. Congress, ran for that race in 1825. It was a five-man race. It was very hotly contested. There was a principal topic that was front and center. Federally funded internal improvements were all the rage on the national level, where Congress was using tax dollars from across the country, mostly through import excise taxes, tariffs, where they would get that money and then they would use it to create roads and bridges and canals, sometimes in individual states. And Polk was one of many who thought this was both bad policy, too much concentration of power in the federal government, and unconstitutional. And this had been a debate in the early days, really since the earliest days of the Republic. But Polk also wanted to win this race, and there was a proposal for a new road from Buffalo all the way to New Orleans that would go through Tennessee, and a lot of people in Tennessee wanted those federal tax dollars to pay for this road. So what did Polk say in response to this question? Well, he made the point that a judicious system of internal improvements within the powers delegated to the general government, I therefore approve. Sounds like telling the people what they wanted to hear, and they were pleased with this, but he really didn't mean it. You got to look at those words again, within the powers delegated to the general government, which Polk basically believed were essentially zero. So it was a very contradictory statement. It really didn't mean what the people thought it meant, because he was really against these kinds of federal fundings, but they kind of heard what they wanted to hear, and he won that race. 30 years old, James Polk is heading to Washington, D.C. to become a member of the United States Congress, but that is the story for another day. That is James Polk and Getting Started, from the life of James Polk. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.